Hello friends of .NET. So today we are doing another review of our backlog. As always, we have some issues first that need to be done for the release, so we go over those, and then afterwards we walk ourselves up from oldest to newest, depending on how far we get with that. So this is a JsonSerializerOptions one that was remaining from the feature. David, are you on the call? You want to walk through it?
Yeah, sure. The things that we missed on the previous effort for making net to the runtime was to add a set of options by ASP.NET, which should be called like CreateForWeb or something like that. So essentially, the only purpose is to place options. But then now that we are seeing of having these options, so we put them lower on the so however post this API with the group, and we were not kind of certain to have this on system tech JSON namespace, and especially on the JSON serializer options with that name, since it's kind of loose and doesn't kind of have any something. It's not so much meaningful for the purpose of the method to exist in there.
Yeah, so I think that does everybody understand the purpose of the API? Because I mean, it's not an API necessarily for us, it's just for centralizing the settings. Cool, then I guess nobody has any objections.
I mean, the discussion that we had that David was talking about was this is very specific to ASP.NET, and CreateForWeb. Does that imply ASP.NET? Does it apply the current version of ASP.NET? What if they change these settings in the future? It's not very. It would be a break and change, I think, if you add a new setting here.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? So the idea. So I named it specifically, not like super specific to ASP.NET when I proposed the name, because it's kind of like, so the reason why I said for web is because it's effectively the default that most people use in the web, right? So like it's the casing policy, for example, of camel case, right? Because most people that exchange stuff on the web, their consumers are JavaScript based, right? So they often want the camel casing policy, right? Versus the normal serializer options that we have are just basically, in .NET you serialize and deserialize just .NET objects. You don't really care about the naming policy, so we just set it to Pascal, right? And so I think that's why we went with for web. But then again, like I don't think ASP.NET will make a break and change there either. So even if they expose something new, I don't think this would be necessarily changing their default settings either, right? So it would be as stable as whatever they have today.
Yeah, I think at the feature meeting, we discussed that they should be calling this one, and we'll acknowledge that they can't ever change their defaults again, because they need to be consistent with the package, or the scenario just doesn't work.
I suppose as new features get added, they can change the default if they need to.
In the version they get added, yeah.
Right.
So cool. Then did they, David, did Ryan ever push back on anything?
Sorry, say that again.
Did Ryan ever push back on anything? Like, I mean, we had it in the spec that they call the API, and they seem to be okay with that. But then I haven't heard anything since then. So I assume that's still the plan.
Yeah.
All right, then this goes into API approved, and that now means we can remove the blocking label. Sweet.
Wait, we're fine with naming and where it is right now.
I would be. I mean, I haven't heard anything else.
Because okay.
I mean, if you have concerns with the names, let me know. Like, we can change it.
Okay, sure.
I mean, are there any other ideas for names?
Well, no, I just copy what you put in the original proposal.
Right. I mean, just to, say things for the purpose of making sure that we said them and know that we're making an explicit decision. We frequently don't like having public constructors and public factories on the same type because people who find one expect the other one doesn't exist. But I don't think we have a better answer than this one, so it seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, the only possible way to do that would be to add some sort of bool or enum to the constructor that says, create for web, but that doesn't seem any better to me.
Yeah, I mean, this has a name, so it's very clear the purpose, and we can slap documentation on it and etc. I think people who are doing their own serialization, they may end up defining exactly a redundant copy of this if they're looking for it because they don't see the factory, but using the constructor gives you power. Using this gives you a set of pre-built defaults, but they're all settable, so you can change it after the fact. But it's or can you? Is this going to be a pre-sealed options?
You can. I mean, David can add in, but we didn't talk about any locking down. So if you call this, you can change the options or set different options until you do the first serialize or deserialize, just like today with the normal constructor.
I'm not sure I mentioned.
But so it's going to return new. It's not going to return the same option every time.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's one of the things I discussed with Jan at some point. Is like, and no, you need to be able to modify the instance, right? Because the most common thing you want to do is register some sort of converter.
Yep.
And so basically the idea is you create for web, and then you get your own instance to mess with. And yes, if somebody is an idiot and they set the casing policy to something else, then that's too bad.
Sure, but yeah, somehow I was deciding this was returning a shared options setting, or but as long as it's returning new, yeah, because it just gives you a better starting place if you're doing the web scenarios. The factory gives it a better name set. I don't think we made a mistake in the past with making the constructor be public.
Although I will say, like, the idea that Steve just said with the enum is not that bad. Actually, the enum might be more discoverable, right? Because when you say new JsonSerializer options and then you see overloads of the constructor and one takes an enum that basically has two values, like, I don't know, standard and web, right? Like, that would not be insane, right? That then you kind of get hinted that, oh, there's potentially different default settings.
So you want enum JsonSerializer defaults?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, that wouldn't be. I think that's actually, from a user standpoint, probably better than the factory.
Okay. That seems legit. It does mean that we do reduce the concept from factory plus constructor to just constructor and constructor overload. So
yeah. So what did you just suggest? You said public enum JsonSerializer default.
Yeah, and then I don't know what to call our current thing other than default, which is a bad name inside defaults. But it's not flagged, so it should be a singular name on the enum type.
Yeah. Let me just.
Or we can decide that it is singular in that it represents a collection of default things. So defaults feels more natural to me somehow. Yeah, then we would have, I guess, yeah, whatever we call the zero value, which is what we're already doing, and then the next value would be web defaults. But again, defaults is redundant, so web.
So using the default, the zero value, will have the same effect of just doing new JSON serializer.
Yeah.
So something like this.
Yeah. I'm not sold on the name generic, but
Yeah,
as the call show, I had no better name. So.
I don't have it. Like, if somebody else has a better suggestion, Steve, do you like that, given that you proposed it?
I think it's a wash, I guess. Maybe it's more discoverable because, yeah, as you're typing, IntelliSense will tell you the overloads for the constructor. So from that standpoint, it's more discoverable. I don't know about the naming so much. I mean, generic, I would just call default because I think that's what we do in a lot of other places, but maybe that's not what we want anymore going forward. I'm not sure. But
it's just a little weird to have defaults.default.
Yeah.
So, you know,
sorry, I missed the beginning of this, but what was the criteria that led us to have the defaults we currently have that might impact the naming?
I think when I discussed it with Austin initially, I think one of the reasons was perf, because if you have if you're case sensitive and Pascal case, for some reason, I think there was some benchmarks that used to be better, and so we went with that.
Well, yeah, because you just get to use the existing string table for the property name, and ordinal match is always faster than.
and
Wait, hold on. We picked our defaults based on perf rather than on desired functionality.
Have you looked at system text, Jason?
Well, there's also JSON is case sensitive by default. Honestly, I think that was the #1 reason, and perf was like, secondary. That was the discussion that I remember. And so why do we want different from JSON spec by default?
Yeah, I mean, the case sensitive comes from the spec. The naming policy is the easiest naming policy is use the name you gave us.
Yeah, and to the points that Steve and Jeremy just raised too, like we disallow things like trailing commas by default unless you opt into it, stuff like that. Things that aren't spec compliant.
But since there's an opinion, the naming policy is one of the things that changes across this. We can't just, it's not JSON serializer defaults, strict or something, because there's an opinion involved as well.
Yeah, I think the perf was specifically for the case sensitivity. The other ones were either a spec compliance or just secure defaults. I think that's one of the rationales we had.
Let me rephrase my question. What scenarios do we expect people to use the existing defaults for if it's not talking to stuff on the net?
Talking to things that aren't the browser.
Yeah, I mean, like in my case, for example, I just use it to serialize settings and store them. Like I just use JSON because I can actually debug it and read it, but I don't exchange it with anybody else.
So then it's like a local?
Yeah, local to file, or document DB when you just store it into the database and you don't actually care about how it's being formatted.
Yeah, or your front end, back end, and they're both .NET.
Yeah, I mean, that's another discussion I had with Austin, right? If you look at the internet, for example, like there's a bunch of stuff. For example, the GitHub APIs have a naming convention that kind of tells you that they use Ruby because they use the Ruby naming conventions, but they return in JSON, right? So it's not uncommon for people to have, client server just talk in a language that happens to match what implementation language they happen to use.
I mean, I guess I'm wondering if we call the default like .NET, have it be.
Oh.
Or local, or something that implies like the scenarios for which it was intended.
Standard. I like that's what somebody suggested in the chat. I don't know. Like I don't like standard. It kind of implies that this is better than the other ones. I mean, .NET wouldn't be insane. It's just a little bit weird because I think it only really makes sense with the naming policy, right? Everything else is just. I think ASP.NET, for example, also had different settings for, the max recursion depth that they protect against, which I think is lower than what we have, which has nothing to do with .NET.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything better than generic, to be honest, because default seems weird.
Well, I actually think .NET might be a good name because, if we added, you mentioned that it sort of leaks that GitHub was using Ruby.
Right.
Like, we could conceivably later get enough demand for, hey, can you give me an accelerator for the things that I can write the class in .NET and it will serialize looking like Ruby did it, etc. So we could end up with .NET and web and Ruby and Python and brainfuck and, which would, I guess, just be a series of pounds and exclamation marks or whatever you do in that language these days.
Yeah, that's pretty much required for .NET 5, I think.
But yeah, so at least that's saying like this represents the defaults for, or that these are the defaults that you get by default in .NET, and then we have that gives us a room to expand for saying this is what the defaults, our equivalent defaults are for some other platform if we choose to do them in the future.
Or don't care. The first time we try and have an apostrophe in a name, but I don't know. Or generic. I don't care.
Yeah.
If we wanted to use generic, I would probably prefer general over generic, because generic is a language term.
Sure.
Works for me. Yeah, I guess general wouldn't be bad, right? If you ever have something that is specific to, I don't know, WebAssembly or something, right? You could imagine if you have general WebAssembly, right? That would be not insane choices.
Fair enough.
I mean, the question also is, do we need an actual enum? Do we expect this to grow? Because we could also just have a Boolean, right? But
the Boolean, like we've already talked about possible places this could expand. So I think that being cautious and doing the enum now is better than finding out next version that a Boolean was bad. Plus the enum makes for much better descriptive code.
yeah, I agree. All right, then let me update the thing I just approved.
Yeah.
Sorry, one question. JSON serializer defaults or JSON serializer options defaults? Are there going to be other things that we're going to have things for, or we just sort of assume that the only thing defaults could apply to are options, and therefore these go hand in hand?
Yeah, I would think of it the latter, because the defaults kind of are configuration settings, right? And the only thing we have for JSON are JSON serializer ones.
Yeah, and then Steve, because I think I did the second guessing myself with singular versus plural right before you joined. How do you feel about the plural name on that?
On defaults?
Yeah.
I think the singular sounds really weird.
Right, and I convinced myself it's because it represents more than one setting. Like you're
Right.
getting the collection of settings, and
Right.
so it is a singular term for a plural concept.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't need to go all Gollum and make a flags version of this be defaults, but
Yes, please.
so okay. All right. Do you feel better about that one, David?
Yeah. Sure.
All right, a one-liner in half an hour. We're having a good trajectory today.
Oh, in my defense, we approved it and then we had ideas, right?
Yeah.
All right, I posted a comment, so all good. So we are happy now. But I still like defaults. I think that would be a great API. I'm very supportive of that.
That one needs to be flags.
Yes.
Flags or flexes? Like, I mean you have to make it on
And then for web will be preciouses.
Yeah.
Oh, look, another one-field enum.
Yeah, so I can talk to that because I filed it. So for Blazor, we need a way to identify the Blazor platform. And as you're probably all aware, we had, I don't know, 100 gazillion discussions about what that actually means. Like, what is Blazor, right? Is there such a thing as a Blazor platform? Is there a Blazor operating system? Is it WebAssembly? And so what we ended up with was to say that we treat WASM itself as an architecture similar to x86 because it's effectively code gen technology. And then logically, when you're executing a Blazor app or a WASM-based app, you have a host that executes your WebAssembly, and we treat that host as the operating system. And so today we only have browser, but in principle, you could imagine other environments that are not the browser that execute WebAssembly, right? And so if you ever need that, we can add that. It's also worth noting that we don't really corner ourselves too much with whatever choice we make here, because we don't really have a way to ask for what the current OS platform is. The way that works is you say runtime information is OS platform and you pass in the one you want to check. So if later on we have, for example, more specific OS platforms, let's say Chrome versus Mozilla versus Edge, we could expose them as well. And then we would just say, yep, if you ask us whether we are a browser, we say yes. But if you also ask us whether we are Mozilla, we would also say yes, right? So this is not necessarily like a cornering decision here, but I think that's kind of the minimum we need in order to make WebAssembly available so that people can make runtime decisions based on whether they can call certain APIs, because you already know that certain APIs won't work in WebAssembly. And so that will be a very easy way to check that, oh, you're running inside of a browser, so don't try to create threads or don't try to write to the file system.
Is OS platform the right thing here?
As opposed to?
As opposed to like any other thing? Like OS stands for something, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that, but I think the question is, what are we, what value are we generating? Because fundamentally, the reason why you want to do an OS check is because you want to call an API that may not work, right? And so the general mechanism that we have exposed for that is runtime information .is OS platform, right? So by us exposing that in that fashion seems more, self-consistent with the other OS checks you would have to write.
Like if we call it an OE platform or operating environment, this would fit. So I think it works. I wonder if we should expand WASM to WebAssembly though.
I think we should, yeah. We tend not to use acronyms like that.
Like it passes the web search test of if you search for WASM, it does, the top hits are to expand it to WebAssembly, but it just kind of looks weird, and I don't think people are gonna type it enough that we care about saving the 6-ish characters.
Yeah, this seems reasonable to me. I just copied and pasted what somebody suggested. I mean, in fairness though, like architecture is already like a grab bag of things. We already have x86, ARM, and so it's not like the most readable names already, but I also have no objection to WebAssembly.
Right, but those are more
trademarked
names and such, versus this one would be like, I mean, pick an assembly language. There are multiple assembly languages for x86, and WASM is just one assembly language that we're using as another intermediate. So it's. I think that we should. Yeah, I feel like we should expand it. It's not. Yeah, it's not the trademark.
If there is a WASM 2 that comes up in the future, would we want that to be called WASM 2, or would we want it to be called WebAssembly 2?
So I say it again. Where does the 2 come from?
So say that there's some capability that gets added to it in the future, but they have to come up with a new language design, so they call it WASM 2 instead of WASM, because it's not fully backward compatible. At that point, do we end up with architecture having a bunch of different fields in it that says WebAssembly, WebAssembly 2, WebAssembly 3, blah, blah, blah? Or at that point, would we say, oh, like this is getting a bit verbose, maybe it should have just been WASM the whole time? I don't know if that's likely to happen.
I think it would depend on.
That's pretty likely to happen. It's actually underway. So there will be WebAssembly or WASM 2.0 at some point.
I think so looking at the things that are in architecture right now, which is ARM, ARM64, x64, and x86, like those sort of go along with our level of, the sort of RID, except we also include the OS in the RID. And so the question would be, is WASM 2 fundamentally incompatible with WASM? Or is it just they've extended it? Because if it's extensions, that's versioning and not an incompatible architecture.
Right.
I mean, I'm aware that x64 is a superset of x86, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, we will probably use this term as a RID as well. So if we kind of standardize architecture for WebAssembly, then we might force people to actually type WebAssembly instead of RIDs if they need to kind of specify full RIDs, which might not be what we actually want.
You think that RID will map exactly, the letters that you type in a RID will map exactly to the letters that are present in this field?
Well, it would look strange if we use, WebAssembly at one place and WASM in another place. Right? If it's basically for the same stuff, it describes the architecture. And the RID are about the architecture, right? So they kind of map pretty clearly today to whatever we are using across the framework.
right.
That is how the code is. That is how the code's written today in Git runtime identifier is get the current architecture .to string it to lower.
Okay.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
that's reasonable.
Okay. I was gonna say there's a difference of the enums are in developers' faces and RIDs are mostly hidden behind NuGet packaging infrastructure, but
But
if we're gonna have a RID generation problem, then
I think in fairness though, I think the vast majority of users will never care about the architecture. The only reason why you might care is because you are loading assemblies yourself somehow or libraries yourself, in which case, if you do architecture checks, you're very likely also having to understand the directory structure of your package in order to make sense of it, and then you're basically confronted with both naming conventions no matter what you do.
yeah.
I had a question on the OS platform stuff real fast. You had mentioned that there's an isOSPlatform API in order to do an OS version check. Is it reasonable that somebody would ask, is OS platform Windows, is OS platform Mac, and expect that to return the correct answer, even if they're inside of a browser process?
But what would they do with that answer? You can't treat the thing as Windows because you can't p-invoke or anything.
No, but you can do things that are specific to the operating systems. For example, if I know that you're coming from an iOS device, then I might pop up a notification saying, hey, download my app from the App Store. And I might target that based on what OS platform I believe you're coming from.
I would think that would be a different question then. But I mean, in principle, we could, so there's nothing fundamentally broken with the design we currently have. It's reasonable for us to return true for, if you ask us whether we are Windows, right? Like we can basically return true for browser and for Windows. But the problem with that approach is how much more code do you break by doing that? Because I think it's a reasonable assumption that most code takes when Windows returns true is that you can p-invoke to anything that is in that given version of Windows, right?
Not necessarily. You often still have to do a capability check separate from the OS.
Depending. I mean, if it's something that's been there since, NT1, then you're pretty well good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, that may mean that we want either OSPlatform.isHostPlatform, which would be what's running the browser, and then the standard console things would just return the same answer, but or that it would be something WebAssembly specific somewhere, which maybe still works in terms of OSPlatform as input, but I don't think that we would. Yeah, I share Emo's concern that is OSPlatform. We essentially wrote it for these classes will or won't work. These p-invokes aren't insane, and making it support both concepts now feels like it's just setting people up for failure.
Okay, that's totally fine. Just wanted to raise the topic.
Yeah, I would just add to that we had there are similar emulation kind of environments, right? It's like when you are running Wine on Linux in a VM on Windows Server, right? It's like which level of the emulation you pick, right? It's, there's like no good answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
The determining what host means is part of why I was thinking of something specific to a WASM scenario to answer that question, because at least it can give you a clear and concise answer of what host means.
Sure, yeah. So for my own edification, then this API would just return the thing that is closest to you. In this particular case, the browser virtual environment.
Right. I think Jan's analogy is quite interesting, because if you really want to do the inception kind of thing, but you want to know what's outside, I think then it's okay if you have to call different APIs, right? Because basically you have to decide how many layers are you aware of, right? So for example, in this case, I think it's reasonable to say, if you say is OSPlatform browser, then you can say, okay, now I can ask some other API from, that the Blazor folks provide you with, for example, to check the browser string, right? And say the browser user agent string. So if you want to know that you're running on Windows, you can still figure this out by looking at that. But you now have to progressively know more about your outside environment, right? Because otherwise, the whole point of emulation is to kind of lie to you, right? To give you the illusion that you're just running, in a particular environment, right? So that's why it's hard to give people, the red pill, if you will, right? You have to kind of opt into the how many red pills are you aware of.
Right. I mean, I can see the browser caring slightly what the host environment is, because it would be things like suggested path presentation and where settings live. There are scenarios where you're trying to tell them how to use their computer outside the browser, but it feels very niche. So yeah, I would say that that's a different API.
I don't think it's that niche.
Let's only. Yeah.
I think the most common thing is probably downloads, right? You just say if you're on Windows, I point you to the Windows exe rather than the the Mac OS exe, right? For example, what .NET does, right? If you go to .NET, we tell you, oh, download .NET Core for your operating system here, right?
Yeah. So maybe we just at our level don't worry about that then, and we just say we'll deal with it if the question comes up from customers.
Yep.
Okay.
Do we also look at environment.os version at all? There's a platform ID in there.
I'm muted. So we had this discussion recently on a side conversation. Yeah, I want to talk about this one as well, but I would like to make that a different topic of conversation, because it's a bigger issue. So there's a few things, right? There's one, then it's already around an environment. A lot of people are using it. I looked at usage recently, and it's actually used a fuck ton, to use the technical term. And so the question is, what are we doing with that? I think the version number, Jan already corrected me that we returned the correct version number, so we no longer return bogus information from there. I think the platform ID is still somewhat broken though, because that already has values that, for example, I think it has Mac OS or something like this, which we which doesn't return macOS on macOS. So there certainly is some issue with that API, but maybe there's some part of it that we should just accept as it's current. For example, the version number we could say is current, but then we say for platform ID, we just obsolete that one and say, please don't use that one because it's no longer the right information. But there certainly is overlap with environment OS version, and for better or worse, we created the other one. And so we have to reduce that overlap somehow.
So what are we doing for platform ID on WASM? Or we're just saying it's obsolete and it's undefined what it's going to return?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
When I'm running on WASM and I call environment.osversion.platform, what value am I going to get back on WASM?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think
probably Win32s.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. There's two sides. There's the version number itself, which is also not clear to me what it would return, because probably the return, like the actual version of the browser is probably also not very well defined. But I think like if you ignore browser for a moment, right? The question is what does OS version return on Linux or Windows today, right? So like there's some things where we return correct information. There's some things where we don't, and we just have to think about that. So, but let's make that a separate discussion. Let's ignore OS version for now because it's a different thing.
Okay, I mean it's named weird that it's OS version, but it's also got the platform ID in it. It's not just the version, right?
Right, but like the reason why I would ignore it is because it's prior art, right? For better or worse, we have both environment.os version, which is already shipped and stable. We can't change it. OSPlatform and interop services has also shipped and is stable, and so we have both concepts no matter what we do, right? And so like one of the problems we have to do is reconcile this overlap.
Right, which may mean that in 5 we need to add a platform ID unknown, just so there's a bucket here that we dump everything else into in the future. Because it used the 0 value to have semantic meaning instead of represent unknown, which is part of its problems. Yeah, I think what's proposed is good, but I agree with Eric that we do in this release need to understand what we're going to be returning for the other API and maybe figure out a permanent we're done with this solution to platform ID.
Is calling it just browser enough? Like, is the WebAssembly standard like solid enough? Browsers, they have a history of varying behaviors.
What would you call it instead?
Well, do we need, for instance, Firefox and Chromium and things like that in here, or is browser truly enough? Like, can someone make meaningful choices off of this that they don't have to do feature detection elsewhere to figure out?
So my position on that is that I don't know, but we start with the most conservative approach, which is we just give you the way to check that you run in the browser. If we need the other browsers, we can add them later. Because of the way the OS checks are being done, you can't ask what you're running in. You can only ask, am I this thing? So we can return is true for both browser and Chromium if you have to, for example.
Or it's like the what host OS is this? The which browser engine is this? Is something that's a browser OS platform specific API somewhere else.
Right.
Okay.
Those are both sort of user agent scraping at that point.
And we said when we're running on WASM, like not in a browser, this will return false. right? Is OSPlatform browser will return false if you're running on a server in WASM when that's supported.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So there are WASM environments that aren't a browser. What if someone's running on a desktop? Like, what if we have Blazor on the desktop or something through one of the JavaScript platforms there?
So you're thinking like something like Electron, for example? I mean, in that case, I would think we would probably add the other thing, whatever it is. Let's say it's Electron, and then we would have browser and Electron, and we'll probably return true for both of them, if you really want to know.
Okay.
Because I think fundamentally we will ship this one first. So most of the code that we'll try to make work inside of WebAssembly would probably just check for its browser, and then later on code might get more enlightened to say, oh, it turns out I'm overly aggressively not exposing functionality that is actually available in when I'm running inside Electron. And then you just add the other if step, and it says, if not browser, then do this other thing unless I'm also in Electron, in which case it will work, right? So that's, you just make incrementally more stuff work this way, right?
But the architecture in that environment would still report WASM.
Yes.
Which is why it's a different vector.
Yes, I think probably they're both useful, right? I mean, WASM is required in order for you to package up native dependencies and being able to load them, right? For the same reason you need to use x86 today. So I think that's kind of an orthogonal choice. But then the OS platform is, I think, mostly for, degrading your experiences in a library when you're inside of Blazor in a meaningful way. All right, so then I think we just concluded that we don't change the API at all as proposed. We keep WASM as the name for the architecture.
One more stupid question, sorry. Is the RID going to be browser-WASM?
I don't know what the RID plan is. Marek, do you know?
Because in general, our RID is like the OS name dash architecture, right? And the other OSs are like Linux, Windows, OS X, etc. So I'm almost wondering if we're aligning with that same pattern where OS platform goes first in the RID and then architecture goes last, if we're going to name it browser-WASM. Or if we're going to name it something else, then maybe this name might. If the answer is nobody knows, that's fine, I guess. I don't know what we would put at the beginning of that RID, to tell you the truth.
I think browser-WASM would not be insane, right? Because that's kind of what we do today, right?
I mean, if this is what we're calling OS platform as browser, I think it totally fits then. That is what we would want to call the RID. Okay.
Yeah, I think Marek is no longer on the call, but we can. I could just add a note and says. Let me actually tag Marek in that. All right, so then all right, remove blocking, remove API ready for review, add API approved. And comment. All right, so, and that was the easy one. Now brace yourself. Not a controversial one. This will fill the remaining hour probably. I'll give you our current trajectory. So, oh God, don't touch my iPad apparently. Bad things will happen when I do that. So, basically we have the situation where we want to provide people with an analyzer that can tell them when they use APIs that are not available to them, right? And that can be either you're on the wrong platform because the API is marked as Windows specific, but you're actually on iOS, or because you're on the wrong version of iOS, right? So the idea for building for iOS and Android is, generally speaking, that you compile against the latest version of the SDK that you have available to you at the time you're building your application. And then you may decide that you want to run on older versions of iOS, in which case you add a setting to your project file that says, I want to run all the way down to, let's say, iOS 10. But the SDK that you have is for iOS 12, in which case every API that was introduced in 11 or later will be flagged by the analyzer and say, this API might not be available to you, so please guard the call. And so the way the analyzer will work is that it will basically check whether your API, your type, your containing symbol, if you will, is itself marked as OS specific, in which case you effectively just shift the burden to the caller of yourself, or you have a code in your method body that basically calls this API and says, am I running on iOS 11 or higher, right? And so this is basically modeled by saying runtime information .is OSPlatform or later. We already have is OSPlatform, but then OSPlatform or later will also allow you to pass in a version number, so you can quickly check whether you can, your minimum is that version number. The interesting thing with the SDKs is that, as you're probably aware, Apple makes what we will consider breaking changes, in that they remove APIs. They will generally not make incompatible changes, meaning they will not change the shape of an API. So that's why you can, generally speaking, always compile against a single SDK and just guard your method calls correctly. And so in the case where the APIs are removed, you would also have to do the inverse check where you say, well, I only call this API if I'm on, let's say, iOS 10 or earlier, because the API was removed in iOS 11, right? And so the way you would do that is you would say is OSPlatform and earlier, or I think I already renamed it based on spec feedback. I think it's called is OSPlatform earlier than, I think is what I expect right now. But the idea there is you basically pass in the version number at which the API was removed, and then the API checks that you're on an earlier version than that. And so this way you always pass in the version number that is actually that corresponds to the annotation of the API, you basically get the correct outputs of that. Does that make sense to people?
I think we're good with the concept. Are we ready for details?
Let's first talk about the concept, because let me just quickly update it based on what I have written in the spec, so we actually talk about the same API. This is the problem when you copy paste content.
So if we have this attribute on various APIs today, and we find a way to make the API cross-plat in the future, is it safe to remove this?
Yeah, so that's a general question that we should talk about. So this was also coming up in the spec. So the way the spec was written was very focused on iOS and Android, and to a certain extent Windows as well, where you really don't talk about general purpose APIs. You really talk about a very specific API. Let's say, some API in the iOS SDK or some API in the Windows SDK, like registry, WMI, things that are inherently OS specific, and they're inherently not portable. They only exist in one OS. And so the only thing you model over time is effectively the version number, but the version number is also a given, right? Like at which version of the platform this API was introduced in, so this stays the same. And so the only thing that can change over time is that you started obsoleting it in a later version or removed it in a later version, right? And that's what this feature is really meant to address. There is this other concern that we have today in the platform, where we have some APIs that are inherently portable but are not supported everywhere, right? So a good example here is our favorite, console.window_with, right? Which apparently we can't get or can't set on anything but Windows. And so the question is, how would we model that? And My personal opinion is that it's very hard to model that over time, because the premise of the feature is annotations in the reference assemblies. So that means if you target something portable, we can only annotate what we know at the given point in time, right? And then you can either have a model where you inclusively say this API is supported on these platforms, or you can say this API is not supported on this platform, right? And there are cases where one is better than the other, but there's no single single best answer, I guess. So I think my general expectation is that I wouldn't use this mechanism for portable APIs. Let's say reflection emit, for example. We would say reflection emit is a feature that is not available on all platforms. The set of platforms that the feature might be available to might shift over time. So we don't have a static knowledge about where that is, and so we just ask it to call a capability API, but you basically ask at runtime, is this feature available or not? And I have another spec for that basically talks about how we would mark capability APIs in a sane way, so that the analyzer could in principle check your code and check whether you are checking the capability. But if you go through the motions, I'm not sure it's always worth it, because it could become fairly noisy. And the question whether we are better off than that. But so if you think of this feature that we have on the screen right now, it's really more about what is the experience of an iOS or Android developer if they want to make the application work on an older version of the platform. Rather than I'm a .NET class library developer and I want to make the API as broadly portable as I can. Because there will be some loss in fidelity by doing that. Is the silence a sign of agreement or disagreement or utter confusion?
I mean, I think I might buy that for ECL devs. Maybe we make a choice that only ever use this specifically on very platform specific things. But I also wonder if users would fall into that recommendation as well, if there was a way we could influence them even. I almost wonder, like, we have some APIs on sockets that are Windows specific today, but we have a PR out that is updating to add support for other platforms. So
yeah, I mean, like, this is a discussion that we had. I had a discussion with Steven. I think I forgot the example was there's a WebSocket API. No, sorry, there's a named pipes API, right? Where if you pass in the name for the pipe, it only works on Windows. If you don't pass in a name for the pipe, then it works everywhere, right? So these are examples where attribution for the API itself doesn't help you much, because it also depends on what values you're passing in. And so I think in order for us to tackle that, we can either do one-off analyzers where we just check for particular patterns in the code, which I think would work for widely used APIs, or we find some sort of mechanism where we can extend our attributes, so that similar to nullability, where we just put in enough attributes in the API surface that we can have generic analyzers that can understand what works and what doesn't, right? But the problem here is really the last mile, right? If you shoot for 100%, it will be very hard, because there is a lot of nuance for, particular things don't work the same across all operating systems, right? But I mean, the example that we have here is that if you're building an iOS 12 app and you want to run on iOS 10, unless we do this feature, you have zero way of knowing that you call an API that was introduced later. You just have to read the docs, which is not very satisfactory. And that one we can relatively easily check.
Yeah, it's. I've got to run to another meeting. Have a good one.
Thanks.
I mentioned this. Sorry, go ahead, Tanner.
I was going to say, has anyone talked to the Windows SDK team to see if this will work for their stuff? Because they've got Microsoft Windows SDK contracts, which exposes the Win 10 version specific APIs for use in general purpose .NET apps. For example, they've got the 17.134, the 17.763, etc. packages for use, and I imagine this would be a perfect example of where they'd want to use the attribute so that people can tie it into this check, etc.
Yeah, so just to catch people up, so my understanding is the way WinRT works moving forward is that we basically, so today the way it works is we import directly Windows, not Windows.winmd, but star.winmd files, right? And then we have some sort of projections that are happening at the metadata side and at the runtime side. And the idea is that there will be a tool that effectively it generates C# specific, or not C# specific, but a .NET specific view over the WinRT surface area. And they already have version attributes in their WinMD files. And so I would expect us to work with them to make sure that either we literally just produce our version information that we spec here, or that our analyzer just understands whatever version number they end up having. But it will be very similar, right? I mean, all the APIs are already annotated with the version number they're introduced in, and that would be something that we would light up here as well. So logically it fits. Whether the actual APIs themselves fit 100%, I think, is something we have to figure out.
Reading the Windows doc, it makes it sound like you shouldn't be checking the version, and instead you should be checking for capabilities. Like, is this API here? Is this enum value?
So I can talk about this a little bit because I think
it's too deep. Are we proposing this too deep into the system? Like, if this is just for iOS and Android, would it be better if these APIs were iOS and Android specific and not every .NET in the world specific?
So the way I see it is that I honestly don't buy capability APIs for that level, because the problem is, unless somebody designed a capability API that you can check, what APIs are you looking for? So for example, take our RefEmit example, right? Like, RefEmit is not supported everywhere, but we have like 12 types or 14 types, and total probably hundreds of members that are applicable to RefEmit. So if you were to write this code against Windows, what symbols are you looking for? You have to pick some symbols, but nobody tells you which ones you need to look for. And it's same is true in the JavaScript world. Like, if you check for the presence of an API, you never check for the presence of all the APIs. You always end up picking some sort of proxy that you say, if this type is present or if this method is present, then I assume all the other things are also present. And that is very fragile over time. Versus the nice thing with this version checks is that the onus is on the SDK author, right? The SDK author is responsible for telling you for every API which version this API was introduced in, which means that the correlation is very trivial, right? The correlation is over the version number. The problem that Windows always had is that people get version checks wrong all the time, and there was basically no tooling, right? But I think the idea here is that, well, we have the tooling, right? The analyzer will tell you if you do the guard checks incorrectly or whether you check for the wrong version number, right? But like statically speaking, we have that information available, and we can surface that, right? Versus if you try to do simple checking, like, what symbols are you checking? And basically there's no coding patterns or like mechanisms you can generally apply to check for arbitrary things without checking every single API you're calling, right? Which doesn't work in general.
So I don't think my last part of the question was answered, though. Like, why, if this is for iOS and Android, why aren't these iOS and Android specific?
No, I don't think it is. All I said was that the feature was designed specifically because that is a requirement that comes from iOS and Android, but based on my own experience with WinRT, it equally applies there. Because, as I said, they have the same mechanisms, right? They already annotate all the API surface with version numbers. And there was at least a community project that did exactly the same thing that we are doing here.
But Windows docs tell you not to do that. The docs say this is how you should check for if a thing is supported or not.
Right, but if you read the docs, they also don't check for the OS version ever, right? I think this is the general problem that we have with the platform. I think that people have this knee-jerk reaction that version checks are bad, but I have yet to see a counter proposal that has a better usability and fewer issues, right? So I don't think this feature is iOS or Android specific. I think it equally applies to the Windows SDK, all up.
Well, I mean, just so we can be talking about it at the layering level, what does it mean on Linux?
Well, I mean, let's start with the simpler question, like, what is Linux-specific API, right? Because realistically, if we talk about Linux, there's basically either you talk about POSIX, which, ideally is everywhere, or you talk about, the arbitrary API changes that happen between Linux distros, right? So I think if you want to talk about Linux, then I think you basically have to talk about a particular distro, right? So you could say, you can effectively model Red Hat over time if you wanted, right? Modeling Linux over time is a bit weird because there really isn't a definition of what Linux actually is.
Well, I mean, there is. Linux is the kernel, but usually if you're p-invoking, you're not asking, is this syscall going to work?
Right, and I think if you look at Linux as just the kernel, then sure, but that also wouldn't be probably very useful to people.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, Android is a form of Linux, right? So in that sense, I mean, it equally applies there, assuming you have a distro that has some sort of binary backwards compatible thinking, right? And you need an SDK, right? You need, somebody needs to give you the information, which version of the platform this API was actually introduced in, right? So that's something that just needs to exist, and that doesn't exist for all of Linux, but that exists for some distros.
Right. Well, I mean, we're gonna have to have a behavior somewhere of what any of these things do on Ubuntu 2004, right? Are we gonna start adding distro-specific OS platforms? Do you use the fact that it's just a strongly typed string and ask Ubuntu? I mean, or maybe it's just that we really don't expect anybody to need to do it on Linux, and so it won't come up. But we'll need to have a behavior defined.
Right. I mean,
this chips.
I mean, the behavior is kind of hard to define, I guess, in general. But you could just say you basically forward the information, or not forward, but you basically extract information from uname and then have some sane mapping, right? And then your special case, the actual things we know about, right? Like OS X, FreeBSD, Android, right? Like known things we have, and then the rest is just the long tail.
Okay, so let's take as a given that that we want to do this, and then we can talk about the specifics, and then maybe that'll change the given.
Right.
So now that you've updated the OS platform, what I was going to point out earlier is Apple this year split iOS into iOS and iPadOS in addition to the already split out tvOS and watchOS.
Right.
So we probably need iPadOS, and now we need to understand the version relationships between all of those, which is going to make that complicated, but that's this library's problem. And now you've added macOS. Are we equivalencing that with OS X, or are they going to be something semantically different?
Oh, that's a good point. I think that's probably just a copy-paste error. I would probably not do that. I mean, so iPadOS we talked about. My understanding from talking to the Xamarin folks is that iPadOS is a marketing term. It's not actual a distro in itself. It's effectively iOS. So basically they said don't model iPadOS yet. So that's why I basically didn't bother. I mean, if it becomes its own distro or its own thing, then yeah, it will be a different thing. But there's also no compatibility relationship between them, right? So basically, if you say is OSPlatform iOS and you're running on iPadOS, then the answer would be no, right? So in that sense, like we don't have to do the thing that we do on NuGet, where we have to map things in particular version numbers to each other and claim they're compatible when they're not.
Well, but I mean that's actually I think wrong from the base is OS platform, because right now if you're on iPadOS and we say we're not modeling iPadOS because they haven't yet split the API surface, we're going to return true for iOS. We can't return false when we decide iPadOS is a distinct operating system because there's different API available.
You say we can't, but
already going to be in there.
I think that is kind of a function of what Apple does, right? Like if Apple does the same thing in their APIs, then we just expose the platform, and if the platform made a break and change, the platform made a break and change. That's just the way that works there, right?
Fair enough.
But I would say that on the Windows side, sorry, on the OS X side, yeah, we probably should not have OS X and macOS. That's probably a bad idea. I would agree with that. Let me just add
it was proposed elsewhere in the issue that we only have one overload and make minor build and revision optional. Did that get considered at all?
So I did consider it. My personal opinion is I wouldn't, and the reason I wouldn't is because version checks are one of those things that people get wrong all the time. So I try to make the methods as brain dead, as simple to call as possible. The thing with optionals is you basically have, like, optionals aren't really ordered, right? You can set them in any order you want as long as you use name syntax, and I'm not sure that makes sense for these kind of things, right? I mean, if you want to specify a build, you should have to specify a minor. Defaulting it to 0 seems kind of odd.
You wouldn't want it defaulted to 0, right? Because then you couldn't say, is it 1.0.3 or is it like 1.1.3, right?
Well, on the other hand, Windows is explicitly 10.0 dot something. It doesn't do 10.1 today. All the checks you do on Windows are going to be 10.0 dot some magic number.
Sure, but what is wrong with that? I mean, that's just the versioning scheme that they have.
You're saying it's more verbose, Tanner?
Right, but I was just saying that you wouldn't want to set minor to 0 or default it to 0, I don't think that's valid, because there's lots of platforms where that is the case. You want a major and potentially a build, but the minor version can just be 0.
Yeah, but you're not saving any characters, right? If you say 10, build colon version number, that's more characters than what is it, like major, comma. So yeah, if you say 10, 0, some version number, that's shorter than 10, build colon some version number, right? Like you're not saving any characters conceptually by doing that. But that also will work for, let's say 1 is fixed, right? And then you're just passing comma 1, or whatever it is, right? Rather than, build colon something else, right?
Right, but the same thing is possible if you just have the last 3 as optional. Because I imagine if we implement this, we're just going to have major forward to the minor build revision 1.
No, I wouldn't. Like, I would get the major and whether it equals, right? Like, is it major 10 even if it's 10.1? Yes. Even if it's 10.9?
That's why it's platform or later.
Right, and if you forward it to the minor one, what did you pass in for the minor?
It would have to be 0. The same thing as the original, as the one without it would have to assume. You'd have to assume just major 10 is less than major 10 minor 1.
Maybe I'm not seeing it, but like, what is the benefit of making them optional?
It just reduces the number of overloads we have, and it allows users to skip parts if they so want to, etc.
Yeah, but as I said, the skipping part is, you're not saving any characters, right? Because like if you skip a part, you just have to put in whatever number it is, right? And you need to know what that number that is, right? That's not an implementation detail, right? Like it's either 0, 1, 2, 3, or whatever it is, right? But that's why I'm kind of saying, like, to me, honestly, the number of overloads is not a concern, because I don't consider overloads as concept count, right? They are all collapsed in IntelliSense. But like the point is, version checks are hard, right? And I'm concerned if people do crazy things like 10, revision equals some value, because I'm not sure that they understand what they just did. Like, are they assuming that the thing in the middle is a wildcard? Are they assuming it's, well, whatever the OS fixed component is? Or are they understanding that they just pass 2 zeros for minor and build? Right, and that's why I think saving overloads, I'm generally not too concerned, but I think in this case, given that version checks have this history of people fucking them up all the time, I would honestly optimize for, let's be a bit more verbose, but like it's also, blindingly, glaringly obvious what the behavior of the API is.
Fair enough.
I mean, the other thing that was come up, though, is should we have an overload that takes a version? The reason I didn't do that was, well, it's more verbose to call, but also because these are APIs you want to get an analyzer to look at, right? And so as soon as you pass in the version number, now it's harder for the analyzer to extract things, because if you construct a version number, people are also more likely to put this in a local variable or put it even in a static variable, and now we have to, crawl that information out from somewhere, versus if you just take 3 ints or 4 ints, people are way more likely to just put them as literals in the code, and then it's very easy for us to find them. So any more concerns with the actual checking APIs? Because I think the attribute ones will probably be even harder.
Do we need the earlier then? Like, why isn't that just OSPlatform, is OSPlatform, blah, and not later than?
That's what it is, but like, so the implementation of these, so if you think from an implementation standpoint, platforms would only have to implement the first 4. The last 4 are basically all aesthetically implementable. But the problem is, how would a user do that, right? Because naively, if they just negate is platform or later, that's the wrong check, because now you're chewing on every platform that is not that particular platform, right? So you always have to check is OS platform, double and not is OS platform or later, right? So you pass an OS platform twice.
So it's strictly a convenience thing.
It is a convenience thing, and same argument applies, right? Like we want to make it kind of hard to write incorrect code. And the only reason why you would call this API is effectively to not call a removed API, or to not call a deprecated API and call the alternative.
Do we know how often that happens? Like if you know, if you're building for version 1, 2, and 3, and it got deprecated in version 2, like, wouldn't you just want to do whatever is supported in 3 for all of them? Like, the only case would be if whatever's done in 3 doesn't work in 1 and 2, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's something I try to get data on. It's actually not that easy with the Apple side. I talked to the iOS folks. It happens pretty much in every release, but like that doesn't mean it's a lot of APIs, right? And I also don't have a good intuition on whether these are popular APIs or not. My understanding is the way Apple usually works is they I don't know whether they call it obsolete. I think they call it deprecation. I think that they deprecate a ton of APIs and they remove some of them, right? Not all of them though. And so my expectation is that the way most people will probably get away with that is by only using OS platform or later. And then the idea is then, let's say in version 1 they shipped an API X, and in version 2 they deprecated API X and introduced API Y. You never have to do OS platform or earlier. Then in this case you can just say OS platform or later 2 and then always call the replacement API, right? That would work. That's a bit harder when you have to support a range, where you have to support, let's say, 4 or 5 version of the OS, and you have to support both cases where the API wasn't obsoleted yet, so the only one that exists is the old one. And you also have to support operating systems where the only API that exists is the new one because they removed the old one. But in this case, it's actually nicer if you can do both API calls, because it also means they don't have to be in the same location in code, right? Because if it's in the same location in code, well, you can write your if check in such a way that it works, right? But if the API has a different behavior and you have to call one during startup and one during shutdown or something like that, then that's much harder to do, right? And given that it's just, one API logically before overloads, it seemed more straightforward to have that. But I can't tell you. My intuition is 90% of calls will be against OS platform or later, and OS platform earlier than is rare. That would be my expectation. How rare? Okay. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, it's just the irreflexive operator. So it lets people use effectively less than if that's the way they think.
Yeah. Yeah, so the version attribution. So that's one thing that I'm not sure I like the outcome. So I would be very happy with constructive feedback here. So logically, there's 3 attributes. So let's look at the derived ones. So that we have added in OS platform version, which basically tells you that the API was added in a particular version. We have removed in a particular version, and we have obsoleted in a particular version. So all of them have to say which OS platform. All of them have to say what version number. Right now, they're all mandatory, which might not be nice. For metadata conciseness, you may want to have constructor overloads that allow you to only pass in the ones you care about. And then they only apply to the things that make sense, right? You can only apply to an assembly, in which case you can mark an entire assembly as OS specific. For example, we could put this on the registry. So registry was introduced in, I don't know, Windows 95 or something, right? So you would just put one attribute on the whole thing. And then there's other cases where you would put them on individual types or methods, right? The OS platform, unfortunately, for metadata reasons, has to be a string. So I did not add string constants. My expectation is the way you would construct this, you would say name of OS platform dot blah, blah, blah. So the strings would match these field names here. And then, yeah, we just exposed the major, minor, build, and revision as APIs. But again, like our analyzer would never do that because they just look at the metadata construction side, right? They never instantiate this attribute, but it felt like exposing that is just the normal pattern that we have. And the only reason
people are going to get the name wrong. OS platform is currently ordinal, not ordinal ignore case, and the constants are all uppercase. So people are going to get that string wrong all the time.
Oh, so you're saying when we say name of Android, then that would not match because the actual string for Android will be all lowercase?
No, the actual string is all uppercase if we go based on the existing convention, and we're doing an ordinal, not an ordinal ignore case comparison.
Yeah, then I would argue we fucked ourselves badly with that. That's not great.
Would it be worth taking the breaking change to make it in ordinal ignore case comparison at this point? I don't think people are realistically going to want to overload on uppercase windows and lowercase windows, for example.
I agree with that. I mean, you could, in principle, break people because somebody happens to rely on that returning false somehow, but I think that's far-fetched. I would agree with that. I think we should probably make it ordinal ignore case. Especially because looking at the naming conventions here, iOS with lowercase I, tvOS with lowercase tv, like, seems a recipe for disaster. Does anybody remember why we did ordinal?
I'm assuming it would probably be for perf, but I have no idea for real.
Yeah, but are you calling this in a tight loop?
I'd imagine there are places where you might want to, but I'd hope that, well, for Android and iOS, the AOT should take care of that.
I mean, yeah, I was...
With the JIT, I'd hope maybe we could eventually optimize it or do something if that is an actual scenario.
Yeah, most of them don't have equal lengths, so they'll all early abort anyway.
It goes back 5 years, so it looks like we just wrote it that way.
Like, I think the simplest case is you're using one of the WinRT multimedia APIs, like querying a performance counter, and so you want to check if that exists, and you're doing that in a tight loop. Similar could exist on iOS or Android, especially if you get into like Unity and stuff. But I'd hope that AOT covers that, and then maybe the JIT can optimize it eventually.
Yeah.
Our RID specific support in NuGet packages isn't great, so I don't think IL trimming will be necessarily easy for that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the other thing I want to point out is I have an inheritance hierarchy here for the OS platform version attributes because it seemed in the docs it's nice if we can group them. And in principle, you could imagine there's some metadata tools that benefit from being able to tell whether that's an OS platform version attribute, but that's really the primary reason. I don't have there's not really a need for polymorphism here, but it seemed nice to do that. because we've done this in the past to group attributes.
Yeah, so you have allow multiple is false.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah, so...
Well, so yeah, if we look at the Apple SDKs, it'll be, this was added tvOS 11 and iOS 18 and macOS 900. Unless you're supposed to, I don't know a way that you can actually model what Apple does.
Right.
If we're looking at their split OS hierarchies.
So originally I had allow multiple true, and originally the design also allowed us to do things like console window width, where we would just say this API is only supported on X, Y, and Z. And then because of my thinking on portable versus OS specific, I removed that and said, screw it, this is only for APIs that exist on one platform. And then, what you just said is also true. The Apple folks basically pushed back on that and said we need to be able to say what you just said, tvOS versus iOS versus macOS. So we probably have to make allow multiple true, but I would expect it to be reserved for things like that, where effectively there's an OS family and there happens to be one SDK for the OS family, but I would not expect us to use that for Android versus iOS versus Windows on the same API, if that makes sense.
Well, but you started with something like console dot window width, right? And if we got to a point where we could make that work on Mac and Windows, but not, the X windowing system generically, would we not? If we were painting it with this stuff of this works on Windows, then we would need to also paint it with this now works on Mac.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I wouldn't originally when I designed this feature, that was my perspective. My perspective was I'm writing a portable class library, and I want to make sure that the APIs that I call work across all operating systems, right? Which is basically what the platform compat analyzer originally did, right? But then the problem is that because these things are moving targets, and window width is clearly not a OS-specific API, right? It's an implementation of what you consider a portable API, right? And so I think that the mechanism that we have for that using these attributes will not work very well because, they would change over time, right? And so then how do we do that in any sane capacity, right? Plus we will now have a ton of these attributes throughout the BCL if we were to do that. What I would do is I would use these attributes for clearly Windows-specific features. So for example, all the Echo stuff I would mark because they're fixed in time. They're Windows only. They will never be working anywhere else. We know the version number, so they're effectively immutable attributions. Console window width doesn't seem like it's in the same category of APIs. And that's why I also said, let's not allow multiple because, you should only have the need for one OS. But unfortunately, iOS makes it a bit more complicated.
I imagine people are going to end up using it in their own APIs for things like that anyways, regardless of whether you want them to use it for something that is specific versus not. I imagine they might version their API such as in this version it only works on Windows, but in V2 it works on Windows and Unix but not Mac.
Right. But I mean,
like Vulkan, for example. Vulkan is a cross-platform, and originally it wasn't going to work on Mac until someone went and created a shim that wraps metal, and so that works on Windows and it works on Linux as is. But if on Mac, there's certain things which only work on Mac, and you have to do a couple extra steps to get it to work. But eventually, it was made to work.
Right. Yeah, I think that's I'm less concerned about that because the analyzer will be well defined. So it's not so much that the feature wouldn't work in this case. It's just that the author of the API kind of forces their consumers to a bunch of breaking changes over time, right? So, if a library author wants to do that, I can't stop them anyways, right? They can also make arbitrary other API breaking changes. The question is just whether we would use it at the platform layer, right? Are we willing to do this to our customers who call console window width over time, right? And my current thinking is the answer to that is no, but maybe the feature works so well that we'll use that for that as well. Because the other reason why I think attributes are bad was because they were still thinking through the .NET standard, lens where the API service is frozen as soon as you ship it, and we don't really have a versioning story for the reference assemblies itself. So if the only thing that would change are attributes, we don't really have a way to model that either. But maybe in the .NET 5 world, where we just update once a year, maybe that's also no longer a concern, and maybe that becomes more viable. I just want to make it clear that, you know, from my point of view, this is not maybe the mechanism to do that. All right, any other things or names? Obsolete is a bit more, it's kind of sad because obsolete basically conflicts with the other obsolete attribute that we have, but unfortunately our obsolete attribute cannot be versioned, right? So we don't know which version this was in. So this would add that. The only thing I added here is the URL. So similar to the obsolete attribute, there's a URL that you can point people to that say, you know, read this document. Maybe we should add this to removed in as well, so that there is some information for what you're supposed to do instead.
Could that maybe just be a general description property that's on all of them? That way you can even link to like the relevant docs for a particular API set for added. Yeah, and I mean, so descriptions, so the reason I don't like description is because you don't know it's a URL, so you can't in the UI actually render it as a link. Versus if it's a URL, you know it's a link, so you can actually make the diagnostic thing in the arrow list, for example, an actual hyperlink, so when people click it, they actually would go somewhere. I mean, you could in principle detect that it's a URL, right, by passing the description or something, but people very often with description fields will just have a, you know, basically a body of text, and then within the text somewhere there's a hyperlink, right? So that's, and it does it, you can't localize it, right? So I mean, obsolete has a message. I think my proposal would be, if we use obsolete moving forward, we don't ever use the description. We just set the diagnostic ID and set the URL, and that's it. And everything else is then localized where you go. So I think, I don't know, description doesn't seem like it's the best way to do it. But I think URL probably would make sense, at least on removed. I'm not sure it makes sense on added in. I mean, maybe, but yeah, I mean, maybe we can just add obsolete directly to the base and then say there's always an optional URL that may or may not be present. Yeah, I think on added, it would be useful for things like, here's a summary of the API and how to use it. Would be a realistic scenario it could get used for. And then with deprecated and removed, it would be, here's the docs on why it was removed and the alternatives to use.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of like, you know, keep in mind that in an actual OS SDK, this attribute is literally on every API. So if you don't have a string on every API, that is significant metadata bloat, right? Because also that link now will be different for every API if you actually link to the actual thing, right? The actual section in the release notes, for example, right? You can't have string interning for that. So for example, think of the Windows SDK with like 100,000 APIs. I'm not sure we would do that.
Can't it just be nullable? That way people who don't want to provide it can make it null?
Yeah, I mean, it would be optional, right? It would be a property get set, right? So you if you don't pass it, you don't pass it, right? All I'm saying is that I think what you just said for introduced in, given that introduced in is literally the most used thing, I just don't think people will use it much. But maybe it's reasonable to say what they're really pointing to is the release. So maybe you can have one string per version number, which are trivially interned, right? All right, so I think I have enough based on this review to actually update the spec. I will mark the APIs still needs work because I think we need more vetting on the actual spec. But I wanted to make sure that, you know, we at least have some sort of understanding of where we are with this.
Yeah, because I was curious, I was just digging back through the OSPlatform's history, and I find nothing that suggested it needed to be ordinal. It was simply first written that way, and that's what we shipped.
Right. All right, so then let's just talk about this one here. The compiler guys aren't here, but maybe we can just make some forward progress on that. So is everybody aware of what init-only properties are? Or should I give you an introduction to that?
Let's do an introduction.
Sorry, Tana, what did you say?
Julian is here.
Oh, Julian is here. Then Julian, please talk about it.
All right. Do you want a quick intro to InitOnly properties?
I think that would be useful because I don't think everybody has that context.
Cool. Apologize, I made a couple updates to this as the discussion went on, and made some clarifications. So part of what's confusing is the scope changed. So presently, the only thing that's in scope is init-only accessors, init-only setters, I should say. Things that are not in scope are init-only methods or init-only fields. So there's a syntax for an init-only setter. We debated, is it a init set or just a init? And then in terms of what we want to emit after discussion, so the backing fields can just be read-only. And then the set accessor would be tagged with an init-only attribute and would have a modrec with the same attribute on the parameter. So the thing that's, I think, not finalized is whether so the attribute is very simple. There's no, it doesn't store anything. It doesn't have any parameters. One of the questions is, what are the attribute targets? So strictly for this scenario, the only attribute target that we need is a method. And there's a question of, do we allow fields proactively, or will we add it if we decide that we need it later on?
I'm muted. The way I understand it is that init-only properties, so they are a different accessor in C# land, but in metadata land, they would just be regular setters, right? So in that sense, they are a superset of what set is, right? It's basically just a type system kind of enforced limitation of when you're allowed to call it, but it's basically still at the metadata level a regular setter.
It's just a setter, so you can only have a get and an init. You cannot have a set and an init, for example. An init is a set.
Right. And then when I actually import metadata, if I ask for the setter, it will actually give me back the set accessor, right? It's not a separate accessor either, right?
That's correct. And then the only change is we'll allow you to set this in a couple new locations. I think there's an example at the very top, first line. Basically, if you're in an object initializer, so between the curly braces there, we consider that still part of the initialization phase, although it's not part of the construction phase. So this is not a place where you're normally allowed to set read-only things, but we would allow you to call the init set.
Which also now means that there is like today, basically, the initializer syntax is just syntactic sugar to avoid saying, C dot, right? And now you would actually have a semantic difference between saying new C and then C dot init only property. That wouldn't work. But if I say new C and then open brace, then that would work, right?
That's correct. And the other oddity that's worth calling out is this would, in the current proposal, this would only work for init-only properties. So there, if you have, there would not be an equivalent for fields where you're allowed to set it during object creation.
Right. So my other question is, so you are modrecking the parameter pass to the setter, I assume that means that both C# and VB, unless they do work and support init only, they would basically correctly report an error that says, sorry, I can't call the setter because there's a mod rec I don't understand.
That's correct.
Hopefully for end-to-end experience, we're working with the IntelliSense team that if they have a compiler that wouldn't understand the mod rec, it just doesn't show the setter. But whatever we do for read-only properties.
I don't think C++ CLI respects mod recs. And I don't think Reflection respects mod recs today.
Correct. Reflection does not respect mod recs. Our serialization libraries also don't respect mod recs. And I know that we've had some discussions on how this might affect system text JSON. I'm wondering if we should actually build into libraries like that knowledge of mod rec in general, and then say, if I see something that I don't understand and it has a mod rec, fail.
Interesting.
So there was a lot of things that were mentioned, and so I lost track a little bit. Reflection does not reflect. I'm not sure that reflection respects read-only either. So I mean, the purpose of this mod rec is to try and prevent people from just using this as a regular setter to the extent that we can.
Right.
Well, the property map table supports more than just get set. Is there any reason we can't just name this init name to make it clear that it's not a standard setter?
It is a, so the thing is, we want to make sure you cannot have a get, a set, and an init. So in that sense, we are saying this is a setter, not a brand new thing. And adding it as a brand new thing, we think would be a lot more impact to the ecosystem.
Yeah, also, just to comment on something that was said earlier, reflection does sometimes forbid setting read-only fields.
Okay.
And I don't know how get-only auto properties are actually emitted in the compile. If they're directly setting the field, then there's no setter for the reflection to bind to. It would have to go find the generated field.
Yeah, I think that's a general question, right? I mean, my understanding is, isn't that also tied to the validator thing, Julian? Isn't the expectation that you have to call validate after you set all the init-only things?
Right, so there's a separate feature under the same umbrella. So this is all under the umbrella of records that we're kind of breaking down into a bunch of separate features. There is a proposal for having a validation at the end of initialization. So the idea would be, well, the main scenario is when you do with. So with is a kind of new construction. It would be a clone, and you'd be able to set some of the properties. And at the very end, when all of those are set, you'd get a chance to validate and fix your fields. Basically close or finalize the initialization.
I guess the reason I'm asking is because it sounds like if that's the case, we probably have to rethink how reflection interacts with that, right? Because naively, I would think like we just block setting the an init-only property with reflection when you just say property info.set. But then, how would you ever initialize them? Because there's no such thing as a what is this thing called? Basically the equivalent of an initializer. Right? We can either introduce that to reflection and say, construct an object and pass us the bunch of things that you want to be initted, and then that one will actually do the right thing and will actually set the property and then also call the validate method if it's there. But that doesn't seem like something we can easily do right now.
So, okay, on the feature of validators, I'm going to find a more quiet place. So validators, we're still discussing. So first, they're not as solid in terms of being in C#9. and they will have holes. So languages, I think we're not planning to try and lock down validators super hard. So there will be ways that you can initialize your thing and not, like if your compiler does not recognize things or through reflection, you could get in a bad state.
Right. Yeah, that seems like something we should have to think about. Like we should probably have a conversation about independently of this. So my other question is, why do you have both the mod rec as well as the init-only attribute applied?
So that's in the context. I wish Jared were here. I might tag him on the meeting if he wants to join, since he's writing the spec for this. Oops. Sorry. All right. So the context is that so initially we also allowed init only on fields, and those were getting the attribute on the field. And then in the context where we also allow init only methods, we would put the attribute on the method. So putting the attribute on the setter here seems like a more consistent thing to do. We could technically, I think we could use just the mod rec as the signal to recognize it, and then we would have an attribute that has no targets, or we would have a type that's maybe just not an attribute.
Yeah, I mean that's how all the other mod recs work today, right? So you would just have a system runtime compiler service is just a marker type that is just init only.
Right, but since we expect that we're going to need to set an attribute on, so the other scenarios I mentioned, I'm not sure that we would be able to do just with the mod rec. So that's why we went with an attribute. So that part I have to say is based on extensions of the current scenario.
I see.
So, for example, would the validator method be probably an attribute rather than a mod rec?
We don't have a spec for the validator.
I see, but is it maybe a reasonable guess that might be one possible implementation?
So it might be an operator. It might be a constructor with an attribute. There's a few ways this could be represented.
Okay, so it's something that we would still need a special case from consumers of reflection then, once we get that step. Okay.
No.
I mean, you would always be able to call a validator, right? It would just be, it's just that when you set the properties, you are required to call the validator afterwards, which...
Well, there is one, we're not sure about the syntax. One of the proposed syntax was to use the same syntax as a constructor, but with no parameter list. And if that's the case, then at least in C#, there would be no way for you to address that and invoke it.
I see.
Why? Okay, so I gotta talk about metadata. Why are we talking about validators?
Sorry. Hi, Jared. Hey! So the question is, why do we need the init-only attribute on the set accessor? Could we just do with the mod rec on the parameter?
On the parameter on the parameter to what?
Of the set accessor.
Why would that? Why? So you basically have to put it on type, and it's going to either be on the parameter. It's going to be you can't put a modrec on an accessor. You have to put it on a type, so it can only go on the parameter.
No,
right. We're not asking about the modrec. We're asking about placing the attributes itself.
So the attribute, though, is just a question of so does the compiler need it? 100% no, don't care. Like we can absolutely, like we have no need for that attribute whatsoever. The question becomes, how do serializers look at that? How do we, like, if we want, because part of serialization is like unwinding these and recreating them. And if you look, there are some serializers today. There was an email that I got CC'd that Fred responded to, where essentially serializers are like, hey, we're not going to touch read-only fields. Bad juju. We don't want to do that. Completely reasonable stance. So the question is, in the future, we want, like, part of doing init-only design is to make sure it can work with serializers. Like, and because this shows up as a get set access for it works fantastic. However, if you get into more complex serialization, there's a question of, do we ever envision a case where serializer might say, like, construction is done, I don't want to actually set these values on these properties. And further, if you think about ahead of time serialization, if you think about people who are writing serializers today, where they're going to use source generators to build them ahead of time, do they have enough information to generate C# code that will compile? Because in order to use kind of this feature in C#, you pretty much have to use an object initializer. You can't do like a simple property set. Now, from the C# symbol model, we will absolutely, it'll be in our symbol model. It'll be very easy to tell. It works great. I guess it's more of a question of how will people know it's init only from reflection? Can we see modrecs? And is it valuable for them to see it? I think that's where the attribute comes important. Do we want to...
You're saying the attribute is a convenience to tell that this is not just a regular set.
Yeah, because from the compiler's perspective, we just look at the modrec is enough. We can live with that. That's not... We could easily just pull that out of the data. And by easily, I mean, I'm saying that Julian has to do the work, so it's easy for me. I have no idea. Julian's name is currently right over his mouth, so I can't see if he's cursing or smiling. Okay, he moved his head back, so now he's smiling. But it doesn't really matter for the compiler.
So that makes sense. I think then the question becomes, I think we had a meta question earlier about reflection. Like, it seems to me reflection has to be aware of it. I think for serializers, and that's I think why we talked about validators, is that, you know, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with setting an init-only property if you don't have a validator. It only really kicks in that, you know, you can only set it when you actually have a validator, right? So you're expected to set all the things and then call the validator, right? So in that sense, it's effectively a serialization thing needs to be aware of it. And if we don't do any work, probably today, given that reflection, I think, ignores modrecs, the naive reflection code that works today will continue to work.
Levi shared a reflection API that lets you get modrecs on a parameter.
Yeah, you can get modrecs and modops. The reason I shared that, by the way, is that there was an earlier question of whether our serializers in general should fail if it sees modrecs that it doesn't understand.
I would say we could talk about that separately, but this is one it should understand. Emo said something, and I want to make it sounded incorrect. I want to make sure he didn't mean it the way he said it. Validators and init-only properties have nothing to do with each other. They will, in concert, work together later, but an init-only properties exist completely independently of validators.
Sure. I guess the question is, so...
And we absolutely want serializers setting init-only properties.
Yeah, so then the question becomes, okay, let's talk about how reflection works today, because my expectation is that probably it will just work the way it is, meaning there's a modrec that is surfaced, but it's probably going to be ignored. So if you just call the setter with the value and the serializer, it will probably just work. It will probably just set the thing, right? Which probably, unless you have a validator that you expect to call, no harm is being done. That's part of the thing. Maybe there's other features that you also have to honor, but the thing is, if we do nothing, maybe serializers are doing the right thing already. And they would not do the right thing if there is a validator that they're expected to call, right? So then, and if that is the case, then I think we should have a reflection feature for that, where maybe the regular property info.setValue will blow when there is a mod rec that says it's an init-only thing. And then maybe you have to call some other API where you have to batch them all up so that the reflection can call the validator afterwards, right? Or something to that extent.
Yeah. Let me push back on one little aspect of that scenario. If you have a deserializer that's hydrating an object out of thin air, then it would make sense for that deserializer to call init properties. If you have a deserializer that's hatching an existing object in place, you might argue that it's improper for that deserializer to call init properties because the object has already been constructed once.
Yeah, I mean, the weird part to me about it using the set slot is public reflection, if we don't change anything in reflection, it will find it and it will look completely callable. And yes, it's a little weird that you're using reflection, but it's weird that now a line of reflection without needing to do private reflection is doing something that the C# language says is invalid and will probably bypass the logic of somebody who's using this feature. Like you thought that this couldn't change after the object was created. You thought it was read-only.
But honestly, that's what reflection does today. Reflection has zero respect for read-only. Public, private, whatever.
But generally, if you want to call private things, you have to say
these are public setters.
Yes, but they're weird. But to reflection, they're going to show up as exactly public setters do today. It's not aware of any of this metadata. And the question is, as part of this, do we need to make it aware?
And I would say that we could make that decision, but the context I've always thought about this in is essentially the following: is public reflection can change public read-only fields. Game over. Like reflection just doesn't care 2 bits about read-only and instance members. And so this is no worse than what we've been doing since 1.0. And if we wanted to look at this and say, okay, you shouldn't use 1.0 as an excuse for continuing to be bad people, then we could discuss that, but we really need to make sure we understood how does it impact serialization and making sure serializers can function with this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, just because something was in V1 doesn't mean we need to keep doing that, right? Like,
did you beep yourself, or do we have auto beeping turned on?
No, I don't. Of course, I did it myself. But no, I think I think the question really is what is the expectation, right? I think read-only fields are relatively rare, right? Like in the sense that people who actually write, code that is serialized over the wire, having public read-only fields is relatively rare. Instance fields, that is, right? So there's probably not a lot of code that is broken by that, right? Versus this one will be one of those features that we put in our blog. We talk a lot about it at conferences. Everybody will have their own syntactic cuteness to do that. And now the question is how much serialization code ends up being broken because the reflection doesn't actually call the validator at all because it's not aware of it. And suddenly you're bypassing all the cute logic that somebody has written, right? And I think that's so in that sense, it's worse than being broken in V1.
But it seems your concern is with validators, not with init-only properties.
Well, to Jared's point, right? My concern is more about other features that you build on top of that, right? Because init-only, the problem really is the semantics of init-only, which is you can only call it after the construction and before any validation logic, right? I think that's kind of how I think about the feature, right? Whether the type actually has a validator is kind of irrelevant in that sense, but practically speaking, it matters, right? Because if you don't have a validator, then having an init-only property just forces people to put it in the curly braces. But if a deserializer just calls it, nothing bad really happens, right? It only really is broken when you actually rely on a validator in your type to reject certain, inputs, which are no longer executed by the deserializer, right? And that's where people probably get burned. And I think that's why we should probably think about how we surface this in reflection and make sure that the default behavior I guess the question is, people that write reflection code today, whether it's serializers or somebody else, how likely are they broken by whatever metadata encoding you're choosing? And is that the right outcome? I mean, you said you will break less of the ecosystem when you reuse the set concept. Sure, but is that actually what you want? Because if you expect people to who call the set method have to do special things, then maybe using the set slot is not the right thing to do.
No, but here's the thing. We want the ecosystem to work as it does today. Like, the reason for choosing set is you're saying, should we do it? And I'm saying we explicitly want this to happen. We want it to be easy for serializers to use this, because the majority case of people who are using reflection to do these properties are serializers. And we want records, we want all of these types to just work with serializers without having to find every serializer ever written, increase their concept count, and get them to do things a different way.
But the code generators are going to be broken.
Currently dealing, like, I understand people get kind of like caught up in this, but it's like the bar we are starting from is serializers. They can break everything today, and it's fine. We have existed that way forever. If you took what we are doing today, like in terms of our fields, like, people would still use reflection, even if we did the most extreme thing where we didn't use set accessors, we generated an unspeakable member, we did all this. Reflection could still beat what we were doing. Like, we can't stop reflection from being bad.
No, it's not about being bulletproof, right? Like, so it's not about being bulletproof. I think the question that I would have to you is that what world is better, right? Is the world better where by default init-only properties are not called, are not supported by the analyzers, by the serializers that have to do work to support them properly? Or is it better when they accidentally use them and then just they don't use it correctly? And I think that's the question that you have to answer for yourself.
And I think the latter world is fine, because I would say it's more about educate the cases where serializers like today do it incorrectly are, I mean, exceedingly rare. Serializers are just like store data, create data. Like, they're not trying to do, they are not giving the data back and then manipulating it afterwards. Like, they see the construction as one basic operation, a unit of atomicity, and then handing it back. And that's okay. Like, it's not particularly valid, like a problem. Now, when we get to validators, like, that's when we're going to want to go and talk to essentially serializers and say, hey, this is something you might want to respect. And the thing is about validators is validators are completely orthogonal to init properties. Validators are a problem that we have with object initializers today that people want to solve forever. And so the decision for, like, I don't think it's valuable to say, like, oh, when you do validators, you regret this. It's like, no, we won't, because validators have all the problems without init properties. Validators are essentially, that's the time we have to go to serializers and say, hey, you have to help. Like, we can't, this is not something we can do for you. Like, you need to participate in the crazy here.
But I think the question is, like, so when will a validator be called, right? Basically, it will be called after the construction and after all init-only properties are being set, right?
Yes.
So
we're discussing a feature that's not fully designed, but yes.
Yeah. So that means, but this goes back to observable difference, right? So if there's no such thing as a validator, right, then there is, from a deserialization standpoint, no observable difference in a public setter and a public init, right? It has the same behavior. It only comes to become an observable difference when there is a validator, right? And that's why I'm saying the question really is, like,
You have to divorce validators from init-only. You really have to. They have nothing to do with each other. Nothing. They are completely orthogonal concepts. Because here's the thing. If validators are supposed to run after object construction is finished on get set properties. So if the serializer deserializes, runs a validator, and then calls a setter, init-only or not init-only, that's a problem. And this is why they're orthogonal concepts.
So let me get this right then. So are you saying that if you have a validator and you don't have any init-only properties, if I construct the object using the collection initializer syntax, I would just set all the normal properties and whatever thing happens, and then the validator is called? Because then okay, that makes sense to me. So that now means that, yes, there would be an observable difference in that context as well, where, if you have no init-only properties and the serializer is not aware of validators at all and will not call it, then that's also a problem. And there's nothing you can do except if you would now mark the constructor of the types with validators, that the constructor itself is basically not callable with the whatever heck we have, right? which probably is also not honored by reflection, right? So this goes back to like reflection will probably, like unless they do work, they can always bypass the validator. And there's nothing we can do about that probably.
Okay.
I mean, unless we change reflection and say, if the constructor is marked in such a way, then we blow up unless you call some other thing. But I don't know what that would be. Okay, so that makes sense to me. So in that sense, okay, so my personal opinion is I would probably prefer it's not being an attribute, because that's just more consistent with what the other mod regs are. They're just plain types and they're just mod regs. And then if we really want to service this information from reflection, I'm not sure the attribute is helping much, because at the end of the day, we probably have to do, expose some API on reflection in order to make that not sucky.
I feel I was more iffy when I didn't think you could get mod recs for reflection, but then Levi showed the sample on how to get it, and it's like, oh, okay. There is a escape hatch. It's not a great one. Long term, if we wanted to expose it, though, we could like take a different designer view to say like expose the net property on field info, or accessor, or property info, whatever.
By the way, I'm looking at the in modifier on parameters, and it looks like that's a mod opt instead of a mod rec. Am I seeing that correctly?
Do it on a virtual method and it'll flip.
Okay, got it.
It's on a non-virtual, it's not a mod. On a virtual, it's a mod rec.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And that's because you can do some really, that really comes down to the fact that if you look at how you can pass array elements, if you pass an array element by in and it's an unsealed type, we don't do the type check. We just say load element ref. And the reason, and so if you violate that, you can basically cause type safety issues in the CLR, because it'll allow you to assign, essentially, when you get to covariant arrays, you can end up assigning the wrong elements into them and violating like array covariant rules. And so we made it a mod rec to basically say like, no, you should never ever use this member unless you understand what in is, so you can not assign to it.
Sure, and I think I misspoke earlier. When it's on a non-virtual method, it looks like it's not a mod opt. It's actually an attribute on the method itself with some kind of parameter ordering data. Okay, yeah. Got it.
Yeah, and I don't think we use. I think Tanner could probably cite chapter and verse of how we didn't use the same thing as in and out, and we did something different because of some historical crazy reason.
Where is this? Sorry, I was reading something else.
Tanner was not paying attention. Kick him out. Kick him. No worry, Tanner. It's not that important. It was the history of one of the decisions around N.
More about the language feature than the attribute, Jared. But while you're trying to make serializers work by using the set slot, presumably code generators, like most designers, are actually going to be broken by this, because they're going to see a set, they're going to write the set call, and then the code doesn't compile.
Generators will have to understand there's no way around that. And that's why in the Roslyn API, we have a whole little thing in the Roslyn API to make it visible so code generators can pick it up and use it. But if you're generating straight line C# code, then yeah, you're going to have to understand the new code patterns if you're going to want to use it.
One more question. Init only is only a thing that applies to a property, correct?
At the moment, yes.
Well, you say at the moment, so I'm actually suggesting renaming this thing to init only property.
Where things get a little bit dicey, because if we decide to allow it on fields or methods in the future, that's where having it as an attribute will have been useful.
Why? I understand for fields because we can't really mod rec a field. But for general members, I would say the logic would apply.
For methods, where would you put the mod rec?
You can always put it on the return type of the method.
Void
all
returning?
Types.
You could too?
Yeah, all methods have return types, so you can always put a mod rec on the return type.
Okay.
But that seems
like we could honestly, if you want to think that far forward, Julian, we could always just say that put it on the void part of the setter and don't put it on the parameter. I'm pretty sure you can attach modrex even to PT void.
So that setters return to the input type.
Setters don't return anything.
Well, it's not attached to the type, it's attached to the parameter, and the return value is a parameter, correct?
Yes.
Like you can get the parameter info for the return value.
Well, because
a special slot.
property set expression returns the input value cast to the property type.
Yeah, that's C#, not IL. In IL, okay. The setter is void.
Oh, good. IL makes more sense.
Don't confuse our crazy ass rules with what.
So that leaves the question: should the modrec go on void then, and should it be an attribute or just a type?
So what do you mean? So what Jared, you just said you can't apply that to fields, but fields would have the same logic, right? If you mark a field as volatile, the volatile is applied to the return value as well. So you could always apply to the return type then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm showing that fields can have modrex and modops as well.
Oh, great.
In which case, I would just say let's call it init only. Just make it not an attribute, and then it's just modrect in the usual spot, whatever that means.
Okay, that works.
I have some thoughts about where we put it, Julian. I'll send you a quick little.
All right,
speed.
but you're okay with saying it's not an attribute, and we can reuse that for other scenarios in the future.
Well, do we want to?
Because I know that with nullable, there's the exploratory thing on saying that this method runs before the nullable state's validated. Was the purpose of init only for method to say that it's still an initialization phase concept, or? Yeah,
and I don't know if we'll do that. There's talk, like we basically said in LDM, like we can put that in our pocket, and if people say they want general init members, we can give it to them.
Because it seems like reserving the attribute for that is more.
But we would do the same thing though. We would just mark them as init members, and we would treat them exactly like properties.
I mean, if it has parameters, it would now be a complicated indexed property.
No, that's why I was going to say. That's what I was going to tell Julian offline. If we think about the more general feature, we should just always throw it on the return type.
Yeah.
It's the easiest place. Then it's consistent.
I agree.
Cool. Then okay. Then the only other thing I say is let's mark it. Let's name it is init only, because it's also consistent with all the other modifiers that always start with is, and then it's just a public sealed class, no nothing, and that seems the easiest thing then for everything.
I'm on board.
Is the behavior that if you're targeting a framework that doesn't have that built-in type, you would just emit it into the DLL as it's being compiled?
No, you have to provide it.
Really? Okay.
Because
so it's different than nullable in that regard.
Because with null, and the reason why is because null, and this is, so basically the divide is always, is it a modrec or not? And the reason why is because if it's with nullability, the attributes don't have to be public. We can just make them internal, generate them in the compiler, and then the compiler can just make like by name copies, and we can basically just say like get or create in the compiler. The problem with modrecs though is they have identity, and so it only works because they have to be as visible as all of the constructs they're using, because we have to copy the signature eidetic into all the assemblies that essentially do overrides. The signature has to be eidetic, has to be exact type match. And the compiler team we have not really crossed the boundary yet where we will silently emit public types into your assembly.
That makes sense.
And so we have not crossed that boundary yet. We did design the feature such that we are saying that we will look for this type by name. And if there's two versions of this type, we will tie break on what is in corelib. And that means that people who want to go back to like net standard 2, they can just define the type. And it'll work. And then when you cross interop with NetStandard 3, the compiler can work out the magic.
But the type should be probably internal, right?
It can't. No, it has to be as accessible as the methods.
Yeah, because if someone's querying for the modrex and modops, they need to be able to check the type against a known thing. That makes sense.
But if they make it public, now you have aliasing issues, right? Because if you have 4 libraries that all define init-only ones, now they all have a public type that is available, right?
Well, that's where I just said the tiebreak rule is we will pick correlate if it exists, and if not, normal C# tiebreaking rules come into play. And you have the exact same problem that you used to have with the extension attribute.
Yeah, I guess the only difference here is that customers never have to refer to the type, so they don't see the aliasing issues. That's fair.
Yeah, but we used to have this with the extension when you did this. Like, which extension attribute do we pick?
One of the things that was brought up previously is, do we need a friendlier API on reflection, like propertyinfo.isInitOnly? Should we open up another issue for that just to track that, or is that not an interesting thing?
No,
I think we should track it.
We should. I mean, there's this general thing that I started last release, right? We should also expose nullability and other things. I mean, there's some pushback from the runtime team to not make it too C# specific, which I quite frankly don't buy, because realistically the vast majority of our customers are C# people, and other languages eventually tend to support C# like features if they're useful. So I think we're better off exposing these things, because if everybody does the crazy, then you have more bugs in the system, because not everybody gets the crazy right? So I think we have to think about how we do this in reflection in general. But this feature seems to be something I can see becoming popular, and then if there's an expectation with other related features like validators and other stuff that we expect reflection to somehow make it easy for people to do that, then we probably want to think about what the feature will look like in reflection.
Okay.
But the nice thing is, like, people can query it today because it's exposed.
Just a quick meta point on it being a modrec. I was just scanning through the spec, and apparently modrecs aren't allowed on public members that are considered CLS compliant. Has the compiler taken that into consideration for existing modrecs it's emitted?
You don't care about CLS compliance.
I thought the compiler still emitted warnings if you had the attribute at a higher level and then emitted a member that was not.
Yep, and if you do that with new features, you get what you get.
Okay.
We basically, honestly, like we should, like, someone pointed out 2 years ago at some point that there were certain things we were, like, I don't think that we give like proper CLS compliant warnings on like
nullability, for example, relies on attributes that are not CLS compliant, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, CLS compliant kind of went out, like, at some point we realized we hadn't been tracking it for a while, and it really just, it's not been a part of the features we've done since then. And I think we should, I know we've had, tentative discussions on should we have a bigger discussion on do we even track it inside of like .NET runtime, because it is affecting your build perf. So CLS compliance is a non-trivial check in the compiler.
Sounds good then.
Yeah. But it's a good point to bring up.
Have you looked at other options to encode this in metadata? Like, for example, with some of the flags that we have?
I didn't. When I looked through it, I didn't see anything that looked particularly appealing. Generally, at this point, we're somewhat wary of using existing flags because it can cause reinterpretations. Like if you look at when we did in, if you had said that C# 1.0 had in, we would have definitely encoded it differently because there was a much more natural attribute to use.
Right.
However, given that that attribute had been in the ecosystem for 18 years, and we could easily find places where people had done it before, like we pretty much said, like, yeah, that's the most obvious and natural way to encode it, and we're not doing it.
Yeah.
That's where I was saying Tanner could probably cite chapter and verse of where the more easy way of encoding in should have been. but due to conflicts with like pinvoke and stuff, it was just pretty obvious we couldn't do it.
Yeah, that was the without. It's just a ref with the out attribute and no mod opt. But within, we had to put the mod opt on it to differentiate the back compat story. But we do actually emit the regular in attribute as well as the mod opt to make sure that pinvoke works correctly without breaking back compat.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily asking whether we should repurpose existing mechanisms, more like adding a new flag, right? Property attributes right now I think has like 4 flags, but it's a U short, right? So we have still flags left on the property that we could use for that. Do people understand what I said, or?
Presumably that requires a runtime change, and Jan's already dropped off the call.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't understand. Like, I don't know, like whether we just blacklist things or whether we just don't care.
Well, I know with the calling conventions, we only have a limited number of bits as well, and it was determined for future calling conventions we're going to use one of the bits to mean you have to now go look at this additional attribute.
Extension.
Yeah. So I don't think using the attribute is necessarily bad. All the bit would really do is say there might be it would be a slightly cheaper check, but not necessarily free, and there's probably more useful things that those 2 bits could be used for.
Well, keep in mind we have only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 property attributes right now, but it's a U short, right? So we have a fuck ton more of slots that we could use. And the platform is 20 years old, and we haven't really done anything like that. So it's just metadata upload, right?
What about fields and methods?
I think it's probably similar. I don't think we have that many slots taken, but I could be wrong. Let's take a quick look. Field attributes. Yeah, field attributes is more problematic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And a bunch of them are probably flags or masks. So yeah, fields might be at the limit already. And method attributes is probably, yeah, same here. It's probably, we might be already at the limit with fields and methods, yes. Yeah, never mind then. All right, so then I think we're good. And we are half an hour over time. And we have not reviewed the backlog. We always fill the time somehow.
Thanks much.
All right, thank you guys.
Immo, before you drop off.
Yes.
I sent an email. We need to schedule more ARM intrinsic API reviews. We've got, I think, 7 issues open, and I'm going to be opening, I think, 2 or 3 more today. So we're going to have, I think, 10 total we have to review, and then we're done.
Okay, so the next slot is May 5th.
Make sure you twist Emo's arm to talk about ARM issues.
We have remote,
I think that's,
so that's fine.
I think that's probably fine, but we might need to schedule a couple or maybe even an additional slot to make sure we get all 10 done. Since it's a non-trivial surface area, and we've used up the entire time the past few times.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I don't think we have additional slots available to us. Like, I already booked 4 extra slots, so now we do reviews twice a week. And I want to use the next week to review the backlog because we haven't done this in a long time. So unless it is massively urgent, I would prefer May 5th.
Okay. As long as the feature is still supposed to ship for .NET 5, so as long as we still meet that, I think we should be good.
Yeah, I mean, like May is nowhere near the shipping date, so that's fine. So tell me roughly, I think we said an email, right? Okay, I will dig it up and then I will schedule the meeting.
Okay, thanks.
Sounds good. All right, guys, enjoy your day.